Dear viewer, welcome to this tale that will transport you to the warm landscapes and deep traditions of rural Mexico in the 19th century. I invite you to immerse yourself in a story where appearances deceive, where an ordinary woman discovers her extraordinary inner strength, and where true love is built with small gestures, furtive glances, and eloquent silences. Where are you watching from today? I'd love to know, because perhaps in your land the jacaranda trees also bloom. Those trees that, as you'll see, will be silent witnesses to our story. If this narrative touches your heart, I ask that you subscribe and leave your like so we can share more stories like this one. Santa Clara del Llano, Mexico, 1878. The dough yielded docilely under Esperanza Gutierrez's expert hands. Her fingers, thick but agile, danced over the flour, as if performing an ancient dance learned in her mother's womb. The aroma of freshly baked bread permeated the small back room of the bakery, her refuge and prison for the past 10 years. At 28, Esperanza had accepted that her destiny was to knead the bread that fed Santa Clara del Llano, a town where her generous figure and humble origins had closed the doors of marriage to her. She was not beautiful according to the strict canons of the time, but her honey-colored eyes held a light that few had known how to appreciate. That April morning, as the first light filtered through the small window, Esperanza held in her floured hands a letter reread so many times that the folds threatened to tear the paper. The proposition from Don Francisco Velasco, a landowner from a neighboring town, was neither romantic nor passionate, but it offered what she had never expected: a home of her own, respect, and perhaps with time affection. "I seek an honest and hard-working woman, not a beauty that would arouse envy," Don Francisco had written. Words that under other circumstances would have hurt any woman's pride, but which Esperanza had received as an unexpected gift. The old quilt that her mother had left as her only inheritance waited folded on the cot. The embroidery, worn by time, told stories of generations of women who had survived loneliness, heartbreak, poverty. Esperanza caressed it with her fingertips, as if she could extract from it the courage she needed. "Gutierrez women do not retreat," she whispered, repeating the words that her mother had engraved in her heart. "No matter how far the destination, our feet know the way." That afternoon, with her mother's quilt as her only treasure, Esperanza boarded the stagecoach that would take her to her new life, unaware that fate had traced for her a path very different from what she imagined under the purple shadow of the jacaranda trees of the San Remigio hacienda. The dust from the road had adhered to Esperanza's skin like a second layer when the stagecoach left her in front of Don Francisco Velasco's house. The afternoon sun fell relentlessly on Santa Clara del Llano, a town that, despite its name, seemed to lack both holiness and clarity. Don Francisco's house was a simple but solid construction, with a porch flanked by pots of thirsty geraniums. Esperanza smoothed the grey dress that she kept for special occasions, arranged her brown hair gathered in a severe bun, and knocked on the door with her heart pounding against her chest. The man who opened the door did not resemble the image she had built in her mind. Don Francisco was short, pudgy, with a shiny bald spot and small eyes that ran over her figure from top to bottom with a disinterest that froze Esperanza's blood. "Are you Esperanza Gutierrez?" he asked with a voice that seemed to carry the weight of an ancient annoyance. "Yes, sir. I have come in response to your letter." Don Francisco emitted a guttural sound, a mixture of snort and contained laughter. "They told me you were of robust complexion, but they didn't mention—" He left the sentence hanging in the air like a suspended knife. "Come in, since you've come from so far away." The interior of the house was dark and stifling. In the living room, a sharp-faced woman waited, sitting with her hands crossed on her lap. Don Francisco made a vague gesture in her direction. "My sister, Doña Luisa. She takes care of the house." The woman's eyes evaluated Esperanza with the precision of a scale, finding her evidently insufficient. The silence that followed was so dense that it could have been cut with a knife. "Francisco," the woman finally said with a cutting voice, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding. This person cannot be the one we were expecting." Esperanza felt the ground beneath her feet turn to quicksand. Her throat closed as if an invisible hand were strangling her. "Miss Gutierrez?" Don Francisco now seemed uncomfortable, avoiding her gaze. "It seems there has been a mistake. I am looking for a woman who can give a distinguished appearance to my home. You will understand that, in my position." The words slid like drops of acid on Esperanza's dignity. Her vision blurred, but she remained upright, clinging to the memory of her mother, to the quilt that kept her secrets. "I understand perfectly, Don Francisco," she said with a voice she did not recognize as her own. "I appreciate your honesty." When she left that house, the sun was beginning to hide, dyeing the sky a bloody orange that seemed to mock her broken hopes. Without enough money for the return journey, and without a place to spend the night, Esperanza found herself wandering through the streets of an unknown town with her dignity as her only luggage. It was then that she saw for the first time the jacaranda trees of the San Remigio hacienda, their violet flowers silhouetted against the twilight like a promise suspended in time. Matias Villanueva's pharmacy was a refuge of aromas and shadows, a place where the essences of dried herbs danced in the air like welcome spirits. The tinkle of the bell announced Esperanza's entrance, whose face, although serene, evidenced the inner storm that shook her. Matias, a middle-aged man with kind eyes framed by round glasses, looked up from his mortars and vials. He saw a woman with the dust of the road still adhering to her skirts, her dignity intact, despite what seemed to have been a long day of disappointments. "How may I serve you, madam?" he asked with the kindness he reserved for lost strangers. "I'm not a madam," Esperanza replied in a quiet voice, "and I only need directions to find a modest inn where I can spend the night." Something in the way that woman pronounced modest like someone who knows the exact value of each coin in her pocket moved the pharmacist. "I'm afraid the only inn in Santa Clara del Llano is no place for a woman traveling alone," said Matias after a moment of reflection. "But my sister and I have a guest room above the pharmacy. It's simple but clean." Surprise softened the tension in Esperanza's face for an instant. "You are very kind, sir, but I cannot accept. I would not want to impose my presence on strangers." "Sometimes Miss Strangers are just friends we haven't recognized yet," replied Matias with a smile that illuminated his tired eyes. "Besides, you look like you could use a tea to calm your nerves, and it happens that I am a specialist in them." That night, sitting at the modest but welcoming table of Matias Villanueva and his sister Rosario Esperanza, narrated her story without self-pity Don Francisco's letter, the hope of a home of her own, the humiliating rejection. She did not mention the tears she had contained, nor the terror she felt at finding herself alone in an unknown town. "Don Francisco Velasco is not an appreciated man in Santa Clara," commented Rosario as she served a second cup of tea. "His fortune does not compensate for his lack of character. Perhaps it's a blessing in disguise, dear," added Matias gently. "A marriage without affection is a golden cage, but a cage nonetheless." Esperanza watched the steam rising from her cup, the ephemeral swirls that vanished in the air like her illusions. "Tomorrow I will take the stagecoach back," she said with determination, "even if it means kneading others' bread for the rest of my days." Matias exchanged a look with his sister, one of those silent communications that only siblings who have shared an entire life can understand. "Before making that decision," suggested the pharmacist, "perhaps you should get to know Santa Clara del Llano a little better. Sometimes the paths that seem closed are just waiting for us to find the right key." That night in the small room above the pharmacy, Esperanza unfolded the old quilt and spread it over the bed. Her fingers traced the familiar embroidery that told stories of resistance. For the first time since leaving her town, she allowed herself to cry, not for Don Francisco's rejection, but for the unexpected kindness of strangers who had treated her with more dignity than those who had supposedly valued her. Outside, the jacaranda trees of the San Remigio hacienda dropped their flowers on the thirsty earth like tears of an impossible color. The San Remigio hacienda stood on a gentle hill on the outskirts of Santa Clara del Llano, like a reminder of more prosperous times. Its ochre walls cracked by the sun, and the years kept stories of grandeur and sadness in equal parts. The jacarandas that flanked the main path were in full bloom, creating a violet canopy that seemed to welcome visitors with a perfumed embrace. Sebastian Mendoza y Cortés, Count of San Remigio, observed the horizon from the main gallery, his erect figure silhouetted against the evening light. At 40, his face chiseled by pain and responsibility, still retained vestiges of a severe beauty. The mourning for Margarita de Olivares, his wife, was still present in the rigorous black of his clothing, although it had been 3 years since her departure. Dad, Dolores, has hidden herself in the garden again and doesn't want to come in for her lessons. The voice of Isabel, his eldest daughter, tore him from his thoughts. At 10, Isabel had assumed a role that did not correspond to her, trying to fill the void left by her mother with a seriousness improper for her age. "Tell Doña Carmen to look for her," Sebastian replied without turning. "You know your sister only responds to her." "I have already done that, Dad, but Doña Carmen is in bed with her pains. And Father Agustin will soon arrive for the catechism lessons." Sebastian exhaled a tired sigh. Since Margarita's death, the hacienda seemed to function in a precarious balance, like a clock whose mechanism had lost essential pieces. Doña Carmen, the housekeeper who had served the family for decades, was aging faster than the walls of San Remigio and the girls. The girls were growing up in a house where laughter had become an elusive visitor. "I'll go look for your sister," he finally said, placing a hand on Isabel's shoulder. "Go change to receive Father Agustin." Isabel nodded and left with silent steps, her small shoulders carrying the weight of invisible responsibilities. Sebastian walked the corridors of the hacienda like a familiar ghost, greeting with brief gestures the servants who stepped aside at his passage. His authority had never been questioned, but he knew that behind the respectful bows, whispers circulated about his prolonged widowhood, about the closed rooms that kept Margarita's memories, about the girls who grew up without the warmth of a mother. The back garden, once Margarita's pride, was now a reflection of the emotional abandonment that permeated San Remigio. The plants grew wild in a freedom that was sadder than beautiful. It was there under an orange tree laden with fruits that no one picked where he found Dolores. At 7, the little girl was a constant reminder of what he had lost. She had Margarita's eyes, large and expressive, and something in her way of moving light as a butterfly squeezed his heart. "Dolores," he called, with a voice that tried to be firm but broke at the edges. "It's time for your lessons." The girl raised her eyes from the book she held in her lap, one of the old volumes of stories that Margarita used to read to her. "This was Mom's favorite," she said with the stark simplicity of childhood. She liked stories where everyone found their place in the end. Sebastian felt something breaking inside him, a dam containing waters that had been repressed for too long. He crouched beside his younger daughter, allowing himself a gesture of tenderness that had become rare. "Your mother would want you to learn your lessons, little one," he whispered, caressing her hair with clumsy fingers. "Father Agustin is about to arrive." Dolores closed the book with reverential care and stood up, shaking her dress with a gesture that painfully reminded him of Margarita. "Doña Carmen says we need help in the house," the girl commented as they walked back. "She says you also need help, Dad." Sebastian kept silent. The words of his daughter, pronounced with innocence, resonated within him like a truth he had been avoiding. San Remigio, like himself, was slowly crumbling under the weight of an absence that no one had dared to fill. That afternoon, as he watched Father Agustin impart catechism lessons to his daughters, Sebastian made a decision that would change the course of their lives. San Remigio needed a female hand, and his daughters a maternal presence. He meanwhile would content himself with the company of his memories and the certainty of having fulfilled his duty. What he did not know as he wrote the letter that Matias Villanueva would deliver to a foreigner staying at his house was that fate had very different plans for the heart he believed definitively closed. The letter arrived with the first ray of sun that slipped through the window of the room above the pharmacy. Esperanza held it in her hands, with the caution of one who has learned to distrust promises written on paper. "The Count of San Remigio is a respectable man," explained Matias, as he watched Esperanza read the missive. "Widowed for 3 years with 2 girls who need attention. The hacienda was prosperous in his father's time, and although it has lost some of its former splendor, it remains a dignified place." Esperanza reread the lines written with firm and elegant calligraphy, so different from the letter that had brought her to Santa Clara del Llano. It was not a marriage proposal, but one of employment. The Count was looking for a governess for his daughters and someone to help oversee the hacienda. The offer included lodging food and a modest but sufficient salary. "Why me?" asked Esperanza, finally looking up. "I have no experience as a governess. My hands only know how to knead bread." Rosario, who was preparing breakfast by the small stove, exchanged a knowing look with her brother. "I spoke about you to the Count when he came to seek medicines for Doña Carmen," confessed Matias. "I told him about your situation and, well, I mentioned that you have a noble character and hard-working hands." Esperanza felt the blush rising up her neck. In her small hometown, no one had ever valued her qualities beyond her ability to bake the best bread in the region. "Besides," added Rosario, approaching, "the Count is not looking for a refined governess, but someone who can give affection to his daughters. The hacienda has become a somber place since the Countess's death." Esperanza left the letter on the table and looked through the window. The jacarandas of San Remigio could be seen in the distance, their branches laden with flowers like a violet sky within reach. Something about those trees called to her, a whisper she could not ignore. "I don't have the skills that a count seeks to educate his daughters," she finally said. "I barely know how to read and write enough, and my manners are not those of a lady." "Sometimes, dear," replied Matias softly, "what books cannot teach is precisely what is most needed. Those girls don't require etiquette lessons as much as they need human warmth." That afternoon, with her worn quilt as her only luggage, Esperanza crossed the threshold of the San Remigio hacienda. The butler, an elderly man with a circumspect expression, led her through corridors of worn tiles that had once known times of splendor. The library where the Count awaited her was a spacious room with shelves that reached the ceiling. Leather-bound books lined up like silent witnesses to generations of learning and privilege. Sebastián Mendoza y Cortés stood up when she entered. He was a tall man of imposing presence with a face that sorrows had sharpened without diminishing its nobility. His dark eyes, deep as wells in which Esperanza feared drowning, studied her without disguise. "Miss Gutierrez," he greeted with a slight nod of his head, "I appreciate that you have considered my proposal." His voice was deep with an accent that revealed a careful education. Esperanza, for the first time conscious of her simple dress and her hands reddened by years of kneading, felt completely out of place. "Count," she responded, making a clumsy curtsy, "I must be honest, I have no experience as a governess, nor do I know the manners expected in a house like this. I am a baker, and although I can read and write, my knowledge is limited." A thick silence settled between them. Sebastián observed her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see through the layers of dignity with which she had protected herself for years. "Miss Gutierrez," he finally said, "I am not looking for a scholar for my daughters. I am looking for someone who can teach them what books do not contain: kindness, honesty, strength. Matias Villanueva speaks very well of you, and his judgment has rarely disappointed me." He paused and approached the window. From there, the jacarandas in bloom could be seen swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. "San Remigio needs new life," he continued almost to himself. "My daughters need a female presence to guide them, and I need help to keep afloat what remains of my ancestors' inheritance." Something in his tone, a vulnerability that contrasted with his aristocratic bearing, touched a fiber in Esperanza's heart. She recognized in him a wounded pride similar to her own, a dignity that struggled against circumstances that threatened to bend it. "I will do my best, Count," she responded with simplicity. "I cannot promise success, but I can promise dedication." Sebastián turned to her, and for a fleeting moment something like a smile softened the severity of his face. "It is more than I have received in a long time, Miss Gutierrez." That night, installed in a room larger and more elegant than she had ever dreamed of, Esperanza unfolded her quilt and spread it over the wide bed. The flowers embroidered by her mother seemed to dialogue with those seen through the window, the jacarandas that stood guard like purple sentinels. "What am I doing here, Mum?" she whispered, caressing the familiar embroidery. "How am I going to live up to what they expect of me?" The silence of the room offered her no answers, but from somewhere, perhaps from the very threads that her mother had woven with love, came a certainty: Gutierrez women did not retreat from challenges. And this, without a doubt, was the greatest she had faced until now. Morning came with the crowing of roosters and the murmur of the hacienda awakening to life. Esperanza, accustomed to rising with the first rays to prepare the bread of the day, was already up when Doña Carmen gently knocked on her door. The housekeeper was an elderly woman with white hair gathered in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to have seen everything. Her face, furrowed by deep wrinkles, had the stillness of one who has learned to keep secrets. "Good morning, Miss Gutierrez," she greeted with a formality that hid certain reserve. "Breakfast is served in the small dining room. The girls are waiting to meet you." Esperanza thanked her for the information, while smoothing the best of the 3 dresses she owned, aware that even so it was too simple for the standards of a house like San Remigio. "Doña Carmen," she dared to ask before the woman retired, "could you give me some advice about the girls? What do they like? What do they dislike?" A shadow of surprise crossed the old woman's face, as if she had not expected that interest. "Isabel, the eldest, is serious and observant," she responded after a moment of doubt. "She likes books and playing the piano, although since Madame Margarita left, she doesn't do it often. Dolores is more," she searched for the right word, "more volatile. She laughs easily, but also cries without apparent reason. She likes stories and spending time in the garden." She paused, and something in her gaze softened slightly. They both miss their mother, each in her own way. "And the Count," her voice lowered until it became almost a whisper. "The Count carries his loss like a cross that no one can help him bear." With these words, Doña Carmen withdrew, leaving behind a silence charged with meaning. Esperanza understood that she had entered a house where grief was one more tenant, an invisible presence that sat at the table and walked the corridors. The small dining room turned out to be a cozy room with windows that overlooked the main garden. The table was set for 4 people with simple but elegant tableware. Isabel and Dolores were already seated, their dark heads inclined in a whisper that was abruptly interrupted when Esperanza entered. "Good morning," she greeted with a smile that tried to hide her nervousness. "I am Esperanza Gutierrez." Isabel, with the rectitude of a little lady, inclined her head in a formal greeting. Her dark eyes, so similar to her father's, evaluated her with a maturity improper for her 10 years. "Good morning, Miss Gutierrez," she responded in a clear voice. "My father has informed us that you will be our new governess." Dolores, on the other hand, observed her with undisguised curiosity, her large and expressive eyes shining with interest. "Is it true that you know how to make bread?" she asked without preamble. "Doña Carmen says your hands can turn flour into gold." Esperanza could not help but smile at the girl's spontaneity. "Not exactly gold, but good bread. Perhaps we could bake together someday if your father thinks it's all right." A clearing of the throat from the door announced Sebastian's presence. He was dressed in black like the day before, but something in his appearance suggested that he had taken special care that morning. His dark hair, with some silver strands at the temples, was carefully combed, and his freshly shaved face gave off a subtle aroma of sandalwood. "Good morning, Miss Gutierrez," he greeted formally. "I see you have already met my daughters." Sebastian took a seat at the head of the table, and breakfast proceeded in a silence barely interrupted by the tinkling of spoons against porcelain. Esperanza felt upon her the curious gaze of Dolores, the silent evaluation of Isabel, and the imposing presence of Sebastian, who seemed absorbed in distant thoughts. It was after breakfast when the Count invited her to tour the hacienda. San Remigio was larger than she had imagined. In addition to the main building, it had stables, barns, a mill, and extensive lands that had once been productive. "Margarita's death coincided with years of drought," explained Sebastian as they walked under the morning sun. "Many workers left seeking fortune elsewhere, and I could not blame them. The land became as arid as—" He interrupted himself, but Esperanza mentally completed the phrase, "as arid as my heart." They reached the limit of the property, where a row of jacarandas marked the border with the main road. The violet flowers floated in the air like a rain stopped in time. "Margarita planted them the year Isabel was born," commented Sebastian, with a voice that pretended to be neutral but betrayed a contained emotion. She said they would be the guardians of San Remigio, that they would protect us from envious looks. Esperanza observed the trees with renewed interest. Now she understood why they had called to her from a distance. They were the legacy of another woman, a symbol of love and protection. "They are beautiful," she said with simplicity. "My mother used to say that flowers are the smiles of the earth. If so, these trees are a laugh of joy amidst the aridity." Sebastian looked at her with surprise, as if he had not expected that comment. "That's a poetic way of seeing them," he responded after a moment of reflection. Margarita also had that ability to find beauty in the everyday. The mention of his late wife hung between them like one of the jacaranda flowers, beautiful and ephemeral. Back at the house, Sebastian stopped in front of a small construction, apart from the main building. He extracted a key from his pocket and opened the door with certain solemnity. "This was Margarita's painting studio," he explained as they entered. "The girls haven't come here since she left. I thought perhaps you could use it for your lessons. It has good light and is quiet." The interior of the studio was preserved, like a time capsule, half-finished canvases, clean and orderly brushes, pots of pigment sealed to prevent them from drying out. On the walls hung portraits of Isabel and Dolores when they were younger, landscapes of San Remigio in more prosperous times, and a portrait of Sebastian that captured not only his appearance but something deeper, a vitality that seemed to have been extinguished with the death of the artist. Esperanza toured the space with respect, conscious that she was being allowed to enter a sanctuary of memories. On a small table, a carved wooden chest caught her attention. Next to it, a note written with delicate calligraphy, "For my daughters when the time is right." Sebastian followed her gaze and approached the chest. "Margarita prepared it during her last days," he explained with a tense voice. "It contains letters, small gifts, objects she considered important. She asked that it be given to the girls when they were older, but she never specified when the time would be right." His fingers brushed the carved wood with a caress so light that he seemed to fear breaking not the object, but the memory it contained. "The girls need someone to guide them, Miss Gutierrez," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "Someone who teaches them to be dignified women in a world that is not always kind to us. I cannot offer them what a mother would give, but perhaps you." He left the sentence unfinished, and Esperanza felt that the weight of these unspoken words was deposited on her shoulders like a responsibility imbued with trust. "I will do everything possible, Count," she responded with a sincerity that was born from the deepest part of her being. Not to replace their mother, because no one could do that, but to help them find their own path. When they left the studio, Sebastian closed the door with a key and offered it to her. "Now it is yours," he said simply. "Use it as you see fit." That gesture, more than any formal contract, sealed the beginning of a new era in San Remigio. What neither of them could imagine was that with that key, Sebastian had not only entrusted her with his late wife's studio, but also, without knowing it, the first door to his own closed heart. The news of Esperanza's arrival at the San Remigio hacienda spread through Santa Clara del Llano with the speed of a flame in a dry field. In the market in the plaza, after Mass, in the meetings of the main ladies of the town, her name was mentioned amidst whispers and sidelong glances. A baker, as a governess, the voice of Doña Mercedes Vargas, wife of Regent Joaquin Morales, rose above the others in the weekly gathering. "The Count must be really desperate, or there is something more that we don't know." The ladies gathered in her salon exchanged significant looks as they sipped chocolate from fine porcelain cups. Doña Mercedes, with her hair dyed an impossible black and her ostentatious jewelry, exercised an iron control over the public opinion of the town. "Matias Villanueva recommended her," timidly commented one of the ladies. "They say she is a decent woman, albeit of humble origin." "Matias has always had a weakness for lost causes," replied Doña Mercedes with a sharp smile. "First it was that brother of his who went to the capital and returned empty-handed, then his sister who never found a husband, and now this foreigner." She made a strategic pause to ensure that all those present were attentive to her words. "Besides, we know she came to Santa Clara responding to an advertisement from Don Francisco Velasco. Isn't it curious that she ended up in San Remigio?" Murmurs of speculation filled the room like a swarm of irritated bees. Reputation was a fragile asset in Santa Clara del Llano, and a rumor was enough to irreparably break it. Meanwhile, oblivious to the gossip, Esperanza was adapting to her new life at the hacienda. She dedicated the mornings to the girls' lessons, reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and what she considered most important practical lessons about life. Words are important, she explained to Isabel and Dolores during a class in Margarita's former painting studio, which now served as an improvised classroom, but actions are even more so. What we do defines who we are. Isabel, always serious and analytical, absorbed each teaching with the intensity of someone seeking answers to questions she still didn't know how to formulate. Dolores, on the other hand, found greater pleasure in practical activities, kneading bread alongside Esperanza, learning to embroider, following the patterns of the old quilt, tending to the small garden they had started together. In the afternoons, Esperanza helped Doña Carmen with the administration of the hacienda. The housekeeper, initially wary, had begun to value her practical sense and her disposition for hard work. "You have good hands, Miss Gutierrez," admitted Doña Carmen one day as they reviewed the pantry reserves together. "Not just for bread, but for everything you touch. The house seems more alive since you arrived." Esperanza received the compliment with a shy smile. In the weeks she had been at San Remigio, she had introduced small changes that added up, were beginning to transform the solemn atmosphere of the hacienda. Fresh flowers in the rooms, the aroma of freshly baked bread, Dolores's laughter that was now heard more frequently. Sebastian observed these changes from a cautious distance. His obligations kept him busy most of the day, but at family dinners, which had now become less silent, his gaze often rested on Esperanza with a mixture of curiosity and something more that not even he dared to name. It was during one of these moments, while Dolores enthusiastically related how they had managed to get a pumpkin seed to germinate in the garden, when they heard the sound of horse hooves approaching the hacienda. The unexpected visit turned out to be Father Agustin, whose habitually serene face showed evident signs of concern. "Sebastian," he said, as soon as the Count received him in the library, "I am sorry to interrupt dinner, but I must speak to you about a delicate matter." Esperanza made a gesture to withdraw to give them privacy, but the priest stopped her with a gesture. "Perhaps it is better that Miss Gutierrez stays," he said gravely. "The matter concerns her directly." Father Agustin's words confirmed what Sebastian had feared. Rumors about Esperanza circulated through the town, fueled by Doña Mercedes's insinuations. Not only her capacity as a governess was questioned, but also her reputation and the true reasons for her presence in San Remigio. "It has even been suggested that," the priest hesitated, visibly uncomfortable, "that there is an improper agreement between you, that Miss Gutierrez occupies a place that does not correspond to her." Esperanza felt the ground opening beneath her feet. Rumors, those invisible but lethal weapons, pursued her, even in this place that she had begun to consider a refuge. "I will not allow slander to soil the name of this house," declared Sebastian, with a coldness that hid a contained anger. "Miss Gutierrez is here on the recommendation of Matias Villanueva, a man whose integrity no one would question." "I know, Sebastian," nodded Father Agustin, "but you know how Santa Clara is. Once a rumor takes root—" "Perhaps I should leave," intervened Esperanza with a quiet but firm voice. "I do not wish to cause problems for your family, Count." Sebastian looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time, a mixture of surprise and something akin to admiration, crossing his austere face. "By no means," he responded with conviction. "Rumors feed on fear. If you leave now, you would only confirm the gossip." He turned to the priest with determination. "Father, I appreciate your concern, but Miss Gutierrez will remain at San Remigio. It will not be Doña Mercedes's poison that dictates the decisions in my house." When Father Agustin left, promising to do what he could to calm the mood in the town, an uncomfortable silence settled between Sebastian and Esperanza. The unspoken words floated in the air like the jacaranda flowers, beautiful but ephemeral. "You should not worry about the rumors, Miss Gutierrez," Sebastian finally said. "They will pass like everything passes in this town." Esperanza nodded. although she knew that gossip had the power to mark entire lives. She had seen it in her own town, where women better than her had seen their reputations destroyed for much less. "The girls," she began but could not finish the sentence. "The girls need you," completed Sebastian in a tone that admitted no reply, "and San Remigio does too." That night, in the solitude of her room, Esperanza unfolded once more her mother's old quilt. Among the familiar embroidery, she sought the strength she would need to face not only the rumors but also the growing certainty that her feelings towards Sebastian Mendoza y Cortez were taking a dangerous direction, one that could confirm Doña Mercedes Vargas's worst suspicions. Outside, the jacarandas swayed under the moonlight, their flowers creating violet shadows on the thirsty earth of the San Remigio hacienda. Like silent sentinels, they seemed to keep secrets that only time would reveal. The visit to Santa Clara del Llano was not something Esperanza had planned, but the shopping list that Doña Carmen handed her that morning left no alternative. The hacienda needed provisions that could only be obtained in town and with the housekeeper. Confined to her room due to her rheumatic pains, the responsibility fell on her shoulders. "Perhaps I should send one of the servants," she suggested, aware of the rumors circulating about her. "Nonsense," replied Doña Carmen firmly. "You have a better eye for choosing, and besides," her voice acquired a softer tone, "it is important that you show yourself in town with your head held high. Rumors feed on fear and shame." Thus Esperanza found herself walking through the main square of Santa Clara with a basket on her arm and a detailed shopping list. She felt the gazes upon her, the whispers that were interrupted at her passage, the forced greetings from those who could not openly ignore her due to her association with the San Remigio hacienda. The market bustled with activity that morning. The fruit and vegetable stalls displayed their colors under the relentless sun, while vendors hawked their wares with voices that competed with each other. Esperanza moved among them with the efficiency of someone who is accustomed to administering limited resources, carefully selecting each purchase, negotiating with firmness but courtesy. It was next to a cloth merchant's stall, where she found herself unexpectedly with Doña Mercedes Vargas. The regent's wife wore a blue silk dress that was excessive for a morning of shopping and jewelry that tinkled with each movement of her bejeweled hands. "Miss Gutierrez," she greeted with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "What a surprise to see you in town. We thought you hardly left the hacienda." The plural was not casual. Two more ladies had stopped next to them, attentive to the exchange like birds of prey. "Good morning, Doña Mercedes," replied Esperanza with education, without letting herself be intimidated. "Indeed, my responsibilities at San Remigio keep me busy, but today it was necessary to acquire some provisions." Of course," the woman's smile sharpened. "You are very dedicated to your functions. The Count must be very satisfied with your services." The double meaning of her words was evident, but Esperanza maintained her composure, remembering her mother's teachings. Dignity is sometimes the only heritage they cannot take from us. "The Count values the well-being of his daughters above all," she responded calmly, "and I strive each day to be worthy of the trust he has placed in me as a governess." Doña Mercedes seemed slightly disconcerted by her serene response. She expected shame, perhaps indignation, but not this tranquil dignity. "Ah, the girls," she said, slightly changing tactics. "It must be difficult for them to have a new female figure in the house, especially for little Isabel. She was so close to her mother." Esperanza felt a pang of pain, not for herself, but for the girls. The idea that their loss was being used as a weapon in this social skirmish seemed intolerable to her. "Isabel and Dolores are exceptional girls," she responded firmly. "Their strength in the face of adversity is an example for all. And now, if you'll excuse me, I must continue with my shopping." With a courteous but definitive nod, Esperanza walked away, feeling Doña Mercedes's gaze fixed on her back like a cold dagger. The rest of her shopping proceeded without incident, but the tension of the encounter had left a bitter taste in her mouth. It was almost with relief that she entered Matias Villanueva's pharmacy, the last establishment on her list. "Esperanza," the pharmacist greeted her with genuine affection. "It's good to see you. How is everything at San Remigio?" the familiarity with which he pronounced her name without titles or formalities was a balm for her troubled spirit. Here was someone who saw her as she was not, as the figure of rumors. Better each day, she responded with a sincere smile. The girls are progressing in their lessons, and the garden we planted is beginning to yield its first fruits. And the Count? Asked Matthias with a penetrating look that seemed to read beyond her words. How is he adapting to all these changes? Esperanza felt a treacherous blush rising up her neck. The question was innocent, but it touched precisely the most vulnerable point of her situation. The Count is mainly occupied with the affairs of the hacienda, she responded, avoiding the pharmacist's gaze. But he seems satisfied with the progress of his daughters. Matthias nodded, deciding not to press further, and proceeded to prepare the remedies that Esperanza had come to seek for Doña Carmen. As he worked, his gaze fell on a small object that rested on one of the shelves. I almost forgot, he said, reaching for what turned out to be a necklace with a jade pendant carved in the shape of a flower. I found this among my mother's belongings. I would like you to have it. Esperanza observed the necklace with surprise. The stone of a deep green veined with white captured the light in a hypnotic way. I cannot accept it, Matthias. It is a family relic. My mother always said this jade had protective properties, insisted the pharmacist, and I think that with the rumors running through the town, you could need all the possible protection. With delicacy, he placed the necklace in Esperanza's hands, closing her fingers around the cool stone. Besides, he added with an enigmatic smile, the green of this stone reminds me of the color that jacaranda leaves acquire after blooming. Perhaps it's a sign. Esperanza was not superstitious, but there was something about that jade in its comforting weight and its deep color that seemed to resonate with something inside her. She put it in the pocket of her dress, thanking the gesture with a smile that said more than any words. Back at the hacienda, the path bordered by blooming jacarandas seemed more beautiful than ever. The afternoon sun drew violet flashes from the fallen flowers, creating a path of light that seemed to welcome her. At first she did not see Sebastian, who was waiting by the main entrance. His tall and erect figure blended with the shadows of the trees, but as she approached, she could distinguish in his face an expression of concern that transformed into relief upon seeing her. Miss Gutierrez, he greeted, advancing to help her with the baskets. I was beginning to worry. You have been away longer than expected. There was something in his tone, a note of anxiety barely disguised, that made Esperanza's heart skip a beat. I apologize if I caused you concern, Count, she responded, handing him one of the baskets. The market was crowded and... She hesitated, about whether to mention her encounter with Doña Mercedes. I had some unexpected conversations. Sebastian looked at her intently, as if trying to read in her face what was left unsaid. Doña Mercedes? He asked with a perspicacity that surprised her. Esperanza nodded, appreciating not having to explain. The Count knew well the social mechanisms of Santa Clara del Llano. I hope she did not disturb you too much, said Sebastian, as they walked together toward the house. Doña Mercedes has a sharp tongue and a special talent for finding the weak points of others. She spoke to me about the girls, replied Esperanza, deciding to be honest. She insinuated that my presence could be disturbing for them, especially for Isabel. Sebastian stopped abruptly, his face darkening. It is typical of her to use my daughters as a weapon, he said with a coldness that contrasted with the warmth of the afternoon. I assure you, Miss Gutierrez, that neither Isabel nor Dolores have expressed discomfort with your presence. On the contrary. He paused, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. This morning, while you were in town, Dolores asked me if we could plant jacarandas in the backyard, like the ones Miss Esperanza likes so much. And I believe it is the first time in a long time that I have heard her speak with such excitement about the future. Something in the way he pronounced these last words, a vulnerability he rarely revealed, made Esperanza feel a lump in her throat. Instinctively, her hand sought the jade in her pocket, clinging to it like a talisman against the overwhelming emotion that threatened to betray her. Jacarandas take years to bloom, she said, with a voice that tried to be firm but trembled slightly. Planting one is an act of faith in the future. Sebastian looked at her in a way that made the world around them seem to stop. For a fleeting instant, Esperanza glimpsed the man he must have been before pain transformed him, a being capable of passion, of joy, of hope. "Then we will plant jacarandas," he declared, with a decision that sounded like a promise, "for the future of San Remigio." And as they continued their way to the house under the evening light that tinged the worn walls of the hacienda with gold, the jade necklace pulsed against Esperanza's skin like a small secret heart, a reminder that sometimes, when we least expect it, life offers us new beginnings. The invitation arrived one morning in late May, when the jacarandas were beginning to lose their flowers, covering the ground with a violet mantle that crunched underfoot. It was an elegant envelope, sealed with red wax, addressed to the Count of San Remigio and family. Regent Joaquin Morales and his wife Doña Mercedes Vargas were offering a dinner at their residence to celebrate the 15th anniversary of their marriage. The invitation clearly specified that the Count and his daughters were expected, accompanied by the governess Miss Gutierrez, if he so desires. "You don't need to attend," said Sebastian when he showed the invitation to Esperanza in the library. "It is evident that Doña Mercedes has some hidden intention." Esperanza held the paper between her fingers, feeling its weight like that of a sentence. In the almost 3 months she had been at San Remigio, she had skillfully avoided social occasions in town protected by the walls of the hacienda and the routine she had established with the girls. "Declining could be interpreted as an admission of guilt," she finally responded. "Or as fear." Sebastian observed her with that intensity she had come to know well, as if trying to decipher the thoughts behind her words. In recent times, since that conversation about planting jacarandas, something had changed between them. Nothing that could be named, nothing that either of them dared to recognize, but it was there in the glances that lasted a second longer than necessary, in the conversations that extended into the night, in the ease with which Count had given way to Sebastian when they were alone. "If you decide to attend, I want you to know that you will not be alone," said Sebastian with a determination that warmed something in Esperanza's chest. "We will face together whatever Doña Mercedes has planned." The together hung between them like an unsolicited but deeply desired promise. The preparations for the dinner occupied the following days. Esperanza's dress was a particular problem. The few she possessed were too simple for an occasion like this, but there was neither time nor resources to make a new one. It was Isabel, with her surprising pragmatism for a 10-year-old girl, who offered a solution. "Mom had many dresses," she said one afternoon, while Esperanza reviewed a geography lesson with her. "They are stored in the closet in her room. I think some might fit you." The proposition left Esperanza speechless. Using Margarita's dresses seemed an act of presumption, almost of profanation. "I couldn't, Isabel. Those dresses belong to your mother." The girl looked at her with a maturity that broke her heart. "Mom doesn't need them anymore," she responded with simplicity. "And I think she would like someone to use them instead of them being spoiled in storage." That afternoon, with Sebastian's tacit permission, who had nodded gravely when Isabel raised the idea during lunch, Esperanza entered for the first time the room that had belonged to Margarita de Olivares. It was a spacious and luminous room, with windows that overlooked the back garden. Although 3 years had passed since her death, something in the air, in the arrangement of the furniture, in the small personal objects carefully placed on the dressing table, spoke of a presence that refused to completely vanish. The closet, an imposing piece of dark wood, contained the dresses ordered by colors. They were beautiful garments of fine fabrics and elegant cuts that spoke of a woman of refined taste and sufficient means to afford small luxuries. With trembling hands, Esperanza caressed the fabric, silks, batistas, cottons of the best quality. She felt like an intruder, a usurper, and yet there was something in that room, in the carefully preserved dresses, that seemed to welcome her. It was a green dress that she finally chose, of a tone similar to that of the jade she now always carried with her. It was simple, but elegant, with a cut that would favor her figure, without being ostentatious. When she tried it on in front of the dressing table mirror, the image it returned surprised her. She seemed another woman, one who could walk with her head high in any salon, even in that of Doña Mercedes Vargas. The night of the dinner arrived too soon. The carriage of the San Remigio hacienda, polished for the occasion, transported the small family toward the regent's residence in the center of town. The girls, dressed in their best finery, showed a mixture of excitement and nervousness at the prospect of a social evening, something infrequent in their lives since their mother's death. Sebastian Elegant, in his formal black suit, had barely said a word during the journey, but the look he had directed at Esperanza when he saw her appear with the green dress and the jade necklace had spoken volumes. The regent's house was the most imposing in Santa Clara del Llano, a two-story construction with colonnades and large windows that tried to emulate the architecture of the capital. The interior was profusely illuminated, and the sound of conversations and laughter escaped through the open windows. Doña Mercedes received them in the vestibule with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Count of San Remigio, what an honor that you have accepted our invitation," she greeted, extending a bejeweled hand that Sebastian kissed with courtesy, but without enthusiasm. "And the girls more beautiful each day. Isabel, you are the living portrait of your mother." Her gaze finally stopped on Esperanza, running over her from head to toe with a scrutiny that did not hide her surprise. "Miss Gutierrez, what a transformation," she commented with a tone that oscillated between forced admiration and barely contained malice. "That dress seems familiar to me. Didn't it belong to—" "It was my mother's," intervened Dolores with the innocence of her 7 years. "But now it is Miss Esperanza's because she also takes care of us." An uncomfortable silence followed these words. Esperanza felt the blush rising up her neck, and Sebastian placed a protective hand on his younger daughter's shoulder. "Miss Gutierrez honors Margarita's memory by wearing her dress," he said with a voice that admitted no reply. "My late wife always valued beauty and dignity, and both are present tonight." The dinner was an exercise in barely disguised tension. Esperanza, seated between the girls and Matias Villanueva, who had also been invited, felt the gazes of the other diners like small needles in her skin. The dress, which had seemed so adequate in the solitude of Margarita's room, now seemed to shout, its borrowed condition, its non-belonging. It was during dessert when Doña Mercedes finally launched the dart she had been reserving all evening. "Count," she said with a honeyed voice, making sure that everyone at the table could hear her, "rumors circulate that San Remigio will again have a lady. Is there any truth in that?" Sebastian, who was taking a sip of wine, placed it slowly on the table. His face betrayed no emotion, but Esperanza, who had learned to read the nuances of his expression, noticed the tension in the line of his jaw. "Rumors rarely contain truth, Doña Mercedes," he responded coldly. "I believe that a lady of your position would be above paying attention to them." A murmur ran through the table. The response, although polite, contained a barely veiled reprimand. "Oh, don't misunderstand me, Count," insisted Doña Mercedes, determined not to yield ground. "We are only concerned about the well-being of your daughters. A maternal figure is so important, and Miss Gutierrez seems to have assumed that role with enthusiasm." The implications were clear, and Esperanza felt the blood freeze in her veins. Instinctively, her hand sought the jade necklace, clinging to it like an anchor in the midst of a storm. It was Matias Villanueva who intervened with the serenity that characterized him. "Miss Gutierrez has been a blessing for San Remigio. And for the girls," he said, addressing not only Doña Mercedes, but the entire table. "Her dedication and kindness are evident to anyone who observes her without prejudice. And her talent for transforming simple ingredients into delicacies," added Father Agustin, who until then had remained silent. "The bread she now bakes for the hacienda is the same that previously fed half the town." A current of affirmation ran through the table. Esperanza's small gestures, the attentions she had had with different inhabitants of the town, the respect with which she treated everyone regardless of their position, had been silently building a network of appreciation that now manifested itself against Doña Mercedes's darts. The hostess, seeing that her strategy was turning against her, tried to change the subject, but the damage to her intention was done. Later, when the evening was coming to an end and the guests were beginning to say goodbye, Sebastian found a moment to speak alone with Esperanza in the exterior gallery. "I am sorry that you had to endure this," he said with sincerity. "Doña, Mercedes has always been difficult. Esperanza observed the jacarandas that could be seen in the distance, dark silhouettes against the night sky, their flowers invisible in the penumbra, but present in her memory. The embroidery on my mother's quilt tells stories of women who survived worse things than Doña Mercedes's words, she responded with a smile that contained all the quiet strength that characterized her. Besides, tonight, I discovered that I have more friends in Santa Clara than I thought. Sebastian looked at her with an intensity that made the world around seem to vanish. In his eyes, usually reserved, shone an emotion that Esperanza did not dare to name. Not only in Santa Clara, he said in a low but firm voice. In San Remigio, you have something more than friends, Esperanza. You have a family. And in that moment, under the starry sky of Santa Clara del Llano, with Margarita's dress caressing her skin and the jade pulsing against her chest, Esperanza knew that whatever happened, she was no longer alone. Summer arrived in Santa Clara del Llano with a relentless heat that cracked the earth and turned the air into a thick, almost palpable substance. The jacarandas of San Remigio had lost their flowers, but their intense green foliage provided a beneficent shade under which Esperanza had taken the habit of imparting the morning lessons. That July morning, while Isabel concentrated on her writing exercises and Dolores drew flowers in her notebook, Esperanza observed the horizon with a thoughtful air. The dinner at the Regent's house a month ago had marked a before and after in her relationship with the town, and in a more subtle but profound way with the Mendoza y Cortés family. The distrustful looks in the market had given way to respectful greetings. Doña Mercedes Vargas, although she had not renounced her insinuations, seemed to have accepted her as a permanent presence in the social life of Santa Clara. And in the San Remigio hacienda, the small daily gestures spoke of a silent but firm transformation. Doña Carmen now consulted her for all important domestic decisions. The workers greeted her with the same respect they showed toward the Count. And the girls? The girls had flourished under her care like flowers after a long drought. Isabel remained serious and responsible, but now her seriousness was nuanced by moments of genuine joy, especially when she played the piano, something she had resumed after years of self-imposed silence. Dolores, always more expressive, had become her shadow, observing each of her movements with admiration and affection. The relationship with Sebastian, however, had become more complex since the night of the dinner. Something had changed between them, as if the words pronounced under the starry sky had opened a door that neither of them knew how to cross. They treated each other with a courtesy charged with unspoken meanings they sought, and avoided each other. At the same time, like two dancers who know the steps, but fear completing the dance. Miss Esperanza, Dolores's voice interrupted her thoughts. Can we go to Mom's studio today? I want to finish my drawing of the jacarandas. Margarita's former painting studio had gradually become a shared space where the girls explored their creativity under Esperanza's guidance. Isabel had discovered a talent for watercolor, while Dolores preferred the vibrant colors of pastel chalks. Of course, replied Esperanza with a smile. But first we must finish these lessons. Isabel, how are you doing with your composition? The girl raised her eyes from her notebook with a concentrated expression. Almost finished. I'm writing about the jacarandas as you suggested, about how Mom planted them and now they protect us. Something in her words, in the naturalness with which she mentioned her mother, while including Esperanza in the story, made her feel a lump in her throat. Isabel, the most reluctant at the beginning, now shared with her memories of Margarita, without the acute pain that previously tinged her voice. Later, while the girls worked absorbed in their creations in the studio, Esperanza observed the carved wooden chest that remained on the small table intact like an unanswered question. Margarita's note, "For my daughters when the time is right," seemed to look at her from its paper silence. "You've never opened it?" asked Isabel, following her gaze. "It's not mine to open," replied Esperanza softly. "Your mother left it for you." Isabel left her brush and approached the chest, touching it with hesitant fingers. "Dad says that Mom wanted us to open it when we were ready," she said in a quiet voice. "But he has never told us when that will be." Dolores joined her sister, her large eyes full of curiosity. "Do you think we could open it now?" she asked, looking at Esperanza as if she had the answer to all the mysteries of the world. Esperanza felt the weight of responsibility like a heavy blanket on her shoulders. It was not her place to decide when the girls should access their mother's last gifts, and yet something in the way they looked at her, in the implicit trust in their eyes, told her that this moment, here and now, could be precisely what Margarita had imagined. "I think we should consult with your father," she finally responded. "It's an important decision." But before they could do anything, the door of the studio opened and Sebastian entered, as if he had been summoned by her thoughts. His presence filled the small space, and his gaze passed from the girls to Esperanza, and finally to the chest that now seemed to be the center of attention. "Am I interrupting something?" he asked, perceiving the atmosphere charged with expectation. "We were talking about Mom's chest," replied Isabel, with the frankness that characterized her. "We were wondering if it was already the right time to open it." Sebastian kept silent for a long moment. His face, usually controlled, revealed a flash of raw emotion quickly suppressed. Esperanza realized that in all these months she had never seen him truly confront Margarita's legacy. It was as if he had built a wall around his pain, allowing the girls to remember their mother, but keeping himself at a distance from those memories. "Your mother," he finally said with a voice that struggled to remain firm, "wanted you to find in this chest consolation and guidance when she was no longer here, but she also wanted you to be ready to receive her words without increasing your pain." He paused and his gaze met Esperanza's as if seeking something that only she could give him. "Perhaps," he continued, now addressing her as much as his daughters, "you are right, Isabel. Perhaps the time has come." With deliberate movements he extracted a small key from his pocket. He had carried it with him all these years, Esperanza understood, waiting for the day when he could finally use it. "Margarita gave me this key," he explained as he approached the chest, "with instructions to give it to you when I considered you were ready. For a long time I believed that day would never come." He stopped with the key suspended over the lock and looked at Esperanza once more. "Until you arrived." The words hung in the air, charged with a meaning that went far beyond the evident. Esperanza felt something expanding inside her chest, a feeling too big to be contained. Isabel took her father's hand, while Dolores clung to Esperanza's skirt. Together, like the family they had become without realizing it, they watched as Sebastian inserted the key into the lock of the chest and turned it with a soft click. The interior was divided into compartments, each containing carefully selected objects, letters written with Margarita's elegant calligraphy, small family jewels, miniatures painted by her books, with personal dedications. But what caught everyone's attention was an envelope placed on top addressed to "My dear Isabel and Dolores, and to whoever takes care of them when I am gone." With trembling hands, Isabel took the envelope and extracted a letter written on ivory-colored paper. The girl's voice, clear and serene, filled the studio as she read the words that her mother had left as her last gift. "My beloved girls, if you are reading these lines, it is because I am no longer physically with you, but my love, like the roots of the jacarandas I planted, continues to nurture your life from a place you cannot see. I do not know how much time has passed since my departure, nor how you have become the wonderful people I know you will be, but I want you to know that wherever you are on your path, I am proud of you. Isabel, my little serious one with eyes that see more than they say, trust your heart as much as your mind. The music you carry inside is a gift too beautiful to keep in silence. Dolores, my restless butterfly, never lose that ability to find beauty in the most unexpected corners. Your laughter is the echo of my greatest joy, and to you, whoever is taking care of my treasures, thank you. Thank you for helping my daughters grow strong and loved. Thank you for keeping the essence of San Remigio alive. Thank you for allowing them to remember me without pain. Sebastian, my love. If you are reading these words alongside our daughters, the time has come to let life bloom again in your heart. Do not betray my memory by clinging to pain. Honor it by learning to love again. The jacarandas I planted will continue to bloom each spring, reminding you that even after the coldest winter, life returns with its most beautiful colors. With eternal love, Margarita. When Isabel finished reading, a profound silence enveloped the studio. Esperanza felt tears running freely down her cheeks without trying to hide them. Dolores sobbed softly against her skirt, but they were liberating tears like a summer rain that cleans the air. And Sebastian had fallen to his knees with his face transformed by an emotion he no longer tried to contain. It was as if Margarita's words had finally opened the floodgate behind which he had kept his pain locked for 3 long years. Esperanza did not know what impelled her, but she found herself kneeling beside him, surrounding him with her arms, while the girls joined the embrace. Thus they remained merged in a circle of shared pain that paradoxically brought with it the first glimpse of true healing. Outside, a sudden breeze stirred the leaves of the jacarandas, as if Margarita herself was sending them a caress from somewhere, beyond time and space. The days that followed the opening of Margarita's chest brought with them a subtle but profound transformation in the San Remigio hacienda. It was as if a spell had been broken, allowing life to flow again through spaces that had remained static for too long. Sebastian was the one who experienced the most visible change. The pain was still there, a familiar presence with which he had learned to coexist, but it was no longer a wall that separated him from the world. He began to participate more actively in the girls' lessons, to dine with them instead of retiring, to the library to laugh at Dolores's occurrences, and to listen attentively to Isabel's reflections. And then there was his relationship with Esperanza. Margarita's words, "learning to love again," seemed to float between them each time they met, charging the air with unexpressed possibilities. One August afternoon, while the girls rested from their nap, and the heat seemed to crush the hacienda under its relentless weight, Esperanza headed to the studio to work on a project she had kept secret. On the easel rested a canvas on which she had been painting during the last weeks a portrait of Isabel and Dolores under the blooming jacarandas. She did not have Margarita's talent, whose works adorned the walls of San Remigio with their ethereal grace, but she had put into each brushstroke all the love she felt for those girls who had become, without her realizing, the exact moment the daughters of her heart. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear the door open, nor the steps that stopped a few meters away. When she finally felt a presence at her back, she turned to find Sebastian observing her with an intensity that left her breathless. "I didn't know you painted," he said with a voice that betrayed his emotion. Esperanza felt the blush rising up her neck. She had never intended for anyone to see the portrait before it was finished, and certainly not Sebastian, whose critical eyes were accustomed to Margarita's mastery. "It's just an attempt," she responded, resisting the impulse to cover the canvas. "I wanted to surprise the girls on their birthday." Sebastian came closer, studying each detail of the work in progress. The light traversed the studio windows, creating a play of golden shadows on his face that made him seem younger, more vulnerable. "It's beautiful," he finally said. "It doesn't resemble how Margarita painted, but it has something equally valuable. There is truth in your brushstrokes." The CP observation, so simple but so profound, touched something inside Esperanza. She had feared, without even admitting it to herself, being compared to the idealized memory of Margarita, and finding herself inevitably insufficient. "Margarita had a gift," she responded with honesty. "I only have love for your daughters." Sebastian kept silent for a moment, as if weighing his next words with extreme care. "Not only for my daughters, I believe," he finally said, with a voice so low that Esperanza could barely hear it. "And they are not only my daughters, are they?" The question hung between them, charged with meanings that both had avoided naming for months. Esperanza felt her heart beating so hard that she feared he could hear it. "No," she admitted, finding a courage she didn't know she possessed. "They are not. Not for me." Sebastian took another step toward her, and now they were so close that she could distinguish the golden flecks in his dark eyes, feel the heat emanating from his body. "Esperanza," he said, pronouncing her name as if it were a prayer, "there is something I need to ask you, but not here. Would you accompany me for a walk to the jacarandas?" The sun was beginning its descent when they went out, projecting elongated shadows over the dried fields. They walked in a silence charged with anticipation, their steps raising small clouds of yellowish dust. The jacarandas, with their intense green foliage, offered a welcome refuge of shade. Under the largest and oldest of them, Sebastian stopped and turned to Esperanza. His face, usually controlled, now showed a vulnerability that moved her deeply. "I have rehearsed this moment hundreds of times in my mind," he began with a smile that betrayed his nervousness. "And yet now that we are here, all the carefully prepared words seem inadequate." He paused as if gathering strength and then continued. "When Margarita died, I believed that a part of me had died with her. I locked myself in my pain as in a fortress, thinking that thus I honored her. But she—" his voice broke slightly. "She knew me better than I knew myself. She knew that someday I would have to learn to live again, to love again." He took Esperanza's hands between his, a gesture so intimate that it seemed to stop time around them. "I did not expect to find that love in a baker with honey-colored eyes and strong hands," he continued with a smile that illuminated his face as Esperanza had never seen it. "A woman who came into my life by chance, or perhaps by a greater design that I cannot comprehend. A woman who returned music to my house, laughter to my daughters, and hope to my heart." Esperanza felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This moment, this precious moment under the jacaranda, deserved to be lived with full clarity. "Sebastian," she began, but he gently placed a finger on her lips. "Let me finish, please," he asked. "I have remained silent too long." He breathed deeply, and then, in a movement that took her completely by surprise, he knelt before her, still holding her hands in his. "Esperanza Gutierrez, you came to San Remigio as a governess, but you have become much more. You are the light that dispelled the shadows, the quiet strength that sustains my family. The woman who, against all probability, taught me that it is possible to love twice in a lifetime in different ways, but equally true." He paused, and his eyes shone with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, the official mother of my daughters, the Lady of San Remigio?" The world seemed to stop. The rustle of the jacaranda leaves, the distant singing of birds, the beating of her own heart. Everything merged into a perfect silence as Sebastian's words resonated in her mind. Throughout her life, Esperanza had been the woman no one chose, too robust, too simple, too direct. And now this man, this widowed count of imposing presence and wounded heart, offered her not only his hand but his entire life. "Sebastian," she finally said, her voice trembling but firm, "when I came to Santa Clara, I was looking for a home, a place to belong. I never imagined that I would find it not in a physical space, but in the heart of two extraordinary girls. And in yours." She squeezed his hands tightly, as if to transmit through the contact all that words could not fully express. "Yes," she responded simply. "Yes, I will marry you. Not for the title nor for the hacienda, but for the family that we already are." Sebastian stood up, and with a naturalness that seemed impossible for two people who had maintained such a formal distance for months, took her in his arms. The kiss that followed was tender, and contained as befitted two souls who, having known pain, valued even more the delicacy of renascent love. When they separated, the setting sun bathed the fields of San Remigio with a golden light that seemed to augur better days, and there under the jacaranda, planted by Margarita Esperanza, understood that sometimes endings are just the prelude to more beautiful beginnings. The news of the engagement between the Count of San Remigio and Esperanza Gutierrez spread through Santa Clara del Llano like fire in a field of dry wheat. To the couple's surprise, the town's response was mostly positive, perhaps because Esperanza had earned with her quiet work and unbreakable dignity the respect of many. Or perhaps because, as Father Agustin pointed out, everyone loved a love story that defied conventions. Doña Mercedes Vargas, of course, was the notable exception. Her biting comments about breads that rise too quickly were barely veiled, but even she had to recognize grudgingly that the Mendoza y Cortez girls flourished under Esperanza's care in a way that had not occurred since their mother's death. At the San Remigio hacienda, the preparations for the wedding transformed the daily routine. September advanced with increasingly temperate days, and the chosen date, the first Sunday of October, promised perfect weather for the ceremony that would be held under the jacarandas. Isabel and Dolores participated in the preparations with an enthusiasm that moved Esperanza. The eldest had assumed the responsibility of supervising the music, insisting on playing the piano herself during the reception. Dolores, for her part, dedicated herself to collecting wildflower seeds that, according to her, would turn the path to the altar into a fairy path. "Do you think Mum will mind?" asked Dolores one afternoon as they embroidered together under the gallery. The question, formulated with the stark honesty of childhood, took Esperanza by surprise. "That I marry your father," she responded, choosing her words carefully. "I don't think so, little one. Your mother loved your father, and you above all else. She would want you to be happy. Isabel says that people are not replaced like broken toys," continued the girl with her eyes fixed on her embroidery. "That you are not replacing Mom, but you are—" how did she say it? "A new branch in our family tree." Esperanza felt her eyes filling with tears. Isabel's wisdom, so improper for her 10 years, was a constant reminder of how pain can mature a young soul. "That's a very beautiful way of seeing it," she said, embracing Dolores. "I don't come to take your mother's place, but to add my own place beside you." At night, when the day's heat subsided and the hacienda sank into a drowsy quietness, Esperanza and Sebastian found moments to be alone. Sometimes they strolled under the stars, talking of trivialities that hid greater promises. Other times they simply remained seated in silence on the gallery, their hands intertwined, as if they feared that upon releasing them, everything might turn out to be a dream. "My mother used to say that happiness, when it arrives late, has a sweeter taste," commented Esperanza on one of these nights, as they observed the sky studded with stars. Sebastian gently squeezed her hand, a gesture that had become familiar between them. "Your mother was a wise woman," he responded in a deep voice. "Mine said something similar, that life gives us what we need when we are prepared to receive it, neither before nor after." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the jacarandas, creating a whisper that seemed a chorus of approval. "Sometimes I think—" Sebastian hesitated, as if fearing to give voice to a thought too intimate, that perhaps Margarita had something to do with all this, that somehow she guided you to San Remigio. Esperanza had thought the same many times, especially since they read the letter from the chest. There was something in the way events had unfolded, a chain of coincidences, too perfect to be casual. "I like to think that it was so," she said, resting her head on Sebastian's shoulder. "That she in some way continues to take care of her family." The wedding dress was another matter that occupied Esperanza's thoughts. She had no resources to commission a new one, and she resisted using one of Margarita's dresses for this particular occasion. It was Matias Villanueva who offered the solution. One afternoon, while Esperanza visited the pharmacy to pick up some herbs for Doña Carmen, the pharmacist handed her a package wrapped in tissue paper. "It was my mother's," he explained with a smile that illuminated his tired eyes. "It was never used. She kept it for a special occasion that never came. I think she would want you to have it." The dress was a marvel of ivory lace and raw silk, simple but elegant, as if it had been specifically designed for her. When she tried it on that night in the privacy of her room, the image the mirror returned left her breathless. It was not the Esperanza who had arrived in Santa Clara del Llano with her dignity as her only luggage, but a woman who had finally found her place in the world. Doña Carmen, upon seeing her with the dress, let escape an exclamation of surprise that she quickly transformed into a grunt of approval. "The hacienda has waited too long for a worthy lady," said the old woman with an emotion she rarely revealed. "San Remigio will again be what it was, even better." The days before the wedding passed in a whirlwind of activity. The entire town seemed to be involved in the preparations. The women baked bread and cakes, the men repaired the road that led to the hacienda, the children collected wildflowers to adorn the church. Even Doña Mercedes Vargas, in a gesture that surprised everyone, sent an embroidered silk shawl as a wedding gift, accompanied by a brief but significant note: "For the new Countess of San Remigio, with my respects." The eve of the wedding, while Esperanza supervised the last details of the banquet that would be served after the ceremony, she found herself thinking about the long road that had led her to this moment. From the small bakery where she had spent 10 years of her life to the hacienda, she now considered her home, from resigned solitude to this mature love that had blossomed when she least expected it. That night, following tradition, Esperanza slept in the house of Matias and Rosario Villanueva. Her mother's quilt-faithful companion of so many lonely nights covered the bed in the guest room, its worn embroidery narrating stories of women who had survived adversity. "For you taught us well, Mum," she whispered, caressing the embroidered flowers with trembling fingers. "Not to retreat, not to lose dignity, to believe that there is always a path." And as sleep gently enveloped her, she seemed to feel a warm presence beside her, as if her mother and perhaps also Margarita watched over her last rest as a single woman. The day dawned clear and bright, as if the sky had decided to dress in gala for the occasion. A fresh air harbinger of the first days of October gently stirred the leaves of the jacarandas that flanked the road to the San Remigio hacienda. Esperanza woke with the first rays of sun slipping through the window of the guest room. For an instant, disoriented by sleep, she did not remember where she was or what day it was. Then, like a warm wave that flooded her inside, realization came to her today. She would become the wife of Sebastian Mendoza y Cortez, Count of San Remigio, the official mother of Isabel and Dolores, the lady of a hacienda that, against all odds, she had come to love as her own. The mirror returned the image of a woman transformed not only by months of good nourishment and outdoor work, but also by an inner light that no adverse circumstance had managed to extinguish. Her honey-colored eyes shone with a mixture of nervousness and determination, and her hair, generally gathered in an austere bun, fell in soft waves over her shoulders. "Today is the day, Mom," she whispered, caressing the embroidered quilt that she would soon definitively transfer to her new room in San Remigio. The day we never believed would come. Rosario Villanueva entered with a breakfast tray and an excited smile. "The entire town is in motion," she announced, as she placed the tray on the small table. "They say such activity has not been seen in Santa Clara since the last great patron saint's feast." Esperanza could barely taste a bite her stomach, a knot of nerves and expectation. The ivory lace dress waited spread out on a chair, along with the jade necklace that she had not taken off since Matias gave it to her months ago. The morning passed in a blur of final preparations. Expert hands arranged her hair, intertwining small white flowers among her brown locks. The dress, which fit perfectly to her generous figure, transformed her into a vision of serene dignity that drew tears from Rosario and an approving nod from Matias. "You are ready," the pharmacist simply said, with a voice charged with contained emotion, "not only for this day but for everything that will come after." The road to the hacienda, where the ceremony would be held under the jacarandas instead of in the town church, as was traditional, was flanked by neighbors who greeted her passage. Some threw petals, others simply inclined their heads in sign of respect. It was upon arriving at the main entrance of San Remigio when Esperanza received the greatest surprise of the day. There, waiting for her by the gate, was Isabel, dressed in a formal suit that made her seem older than her 10 years. "I've come to fetch you," the girl announced with a seriousness that did not manage to hide her emotion. "Dad says it's tradition for the man of the family to accompany the bride. Since you don't have a father or brother, I thought that I could." The words hung in the air, charged with a meaning that went far beyond the evident. Isabel was not only accepting her as her father's wife, but also as an integral part of her family, as someone she wanted to honor with this deeply symbolic gesture. "Nothing would make me happier," replied Esperanza, with a voice trembling with emotion, offering her arm to the girl. Together they walked the path of wildflowers that Dolores had prepared with such dedication. At the end, under the oldest and most majestic jacaranda, waited Sebastian with Father Agustin on one side and Dolores on the other, holding a small bouquet of flowers. The guests, a mixture of hacienda workers and town neighbors, stood up when Esperanza appeared on Isabel's arm. Their gazes, some tearful, others smiling, all warm, accompanied her on her way to the man who had redefined her destiny. Sebastian, elegant in his black suit with silver details, observed her approach with an expression that Esperanza would keep forever in her memory, a mixture of astonishment, gratitude, and love so deep that it seemed impossible to contain. When she finally reached his side, When Isabel symbolically placed Esperanza's hand in her father's and joined her sister, the world seemed to stop. Only they four existed, a family forged not by blood, but by something equally powerful, the conscious choice to love and protect each other. The ceremony was simple but charged with meaning. Father Agustin spoke of second chances of love that blossoms in the most unexpected places, of the human heart's capacity to expand and embrace new forms of happiness without betraying old ones. When the moment for the vows arrived, Sebastian took Esperanza's hands between his dark eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world disappear. "Esperanza," he began with a voice that only trembled slightly. "When Margarita died, I believed that light had definitively gone out in my life. I became a shadow of myself, unable to see beyond my pain. Then one day you appeared with your unbreakable dignity, your quiet strength, your capacity to find beauty, even in the most adverse circumstances." He paused, breathing deeply, as if the words that followed required a particular effort. "I do not promise you a path without difficulties. San Remigio, as you well know, has known better days, but I promise you that we will face each challenge together. I promise you respect, honesty, and a love that grows each day like those jacarandas that observe us rooting more deeply with each season." A solitary tear slid down Esperanza's cheek as she listened to these words that seemed to respond to longings, so ancient that she barely knew she harbored them. "Sebastian," she responded with a clear voice despite the emotion, "I arrived in Santa Clara del Llano looking for a home and found much more a family. In your daughters I discovered the joy I thought I would never know, and in you a companion with whom to share not only the luminous days, but also the dark nights." She looked briefly at Isabel and Dolores, who observed the scene with eyes bright with emotion. "I promise to be not only a wife for you, but also a mother for your daughters. I promise to work each day to make San Remigio the happy home it deserves to be. I promise to love the past that formed you as much as the future we will build together." Father Agustin declared them husband and wife with a smile that illuminated his usually serene face. When Sebastian leaned down to seal their union with a kiss, a murmur of approval ran through the audience. It was not the passionate kiss of young lovers, but the more measured and profound gesture of two people who have learned the true value of human connection. The reception that followed was a celebration of Renaissance life, not only for the newlyweds, but for the entire San Remigio hacienda. Music flowed, wine ran generously, and laughter floated in the air like the ancient flowers of the jacarandas, creating an atmosphere of contagious joy. Isabel played the piano, as she had promised, her small but sure fingers drawing melodies that had not been heard in San Remigio since her mother's death. Dolores danced with an energy that seemed impossible to contain, dragging all the guests to join her. It was during a moment of calm while Esperanza conversed with Matias and Rosario Villanueva when she noticed that Sebastian had disappeared. She found him in the study contemplating a portrait of Margarita that presided over the room. "Are you all right?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Sebastian turned to her with a smile that contained both sadness and peace. "It's strange," he said, taking her hand. "For 3 years I feared this moment, feared feeling that I betrayed her if I became happy again, and now that it has arrived, it's as if she were here, approving it all." Esperanza followed his gaze to the portrait. Margarita de Olivares observed her from the canvas with serene eyes, as if she truly were witness to this new stage in her family's life. "She is here," replied Esperanza softly. "In Isabel, in Dolores, in the jacarandas, in every corner of San Remigio. And she always will be." The celebration continued well into the night. Candles illuminated the garden with a golden glow that transformed reality into something almost magical. The guests, satisfied with the food, the wine, and the shared happiness, began to withdraw little by little, leaving behind blessings and good wishes. When finally only they remained, Sebastian took Esperanza's hand and led her toward the jacaranda under which they had married. The full moon bathed the landscape with a silver light, turning the shadows into delicate lace. "Welcome home, Countess. Fau San Remigio," he said with a smile that mixed tenderness and something more intense that made Esperanza's heart beat faster. Home, she repeated, savoring the word like a sweet and long-desired fruit. How beautiful it sounds. And as they returned together to the hacienda, where the girls already slept and a new life awaited them, Esperanza felt that she had finally arrived at the place where she belonged, not only physically, but in the deepest sense of the term, a place not defined by walls or titles, but by the hearts that now beat in unison with hers. 3 years later, the San Remigio hacienda shone under the April sun like a jewel recovered from among the ashes. The fields, once dried and abandoned now, produced abundant harvests that had returned prosperity to the region. The buildings, carefully restored, shone with a renewed but authentic dignity, like that of someone who has survived a long illness and values each day of recovered health. But the most notable change was the jacarandas. Not only the old ones planted by Margarita, which continued to stand guard along the main path, but also the new ones, young trees that now grew in the backyard, at the limits of the property, even around the workers' houses. Under the most majestic of these trees, the one that had witnessed so many crucial moments in the life of the Mendoza y Cortez family, Esperanza gently rocked Miguel, the 2-year-old son, who had arrived to complete the circle that began that day, under the same jacaranda when Sebastian proposed marriage to her. The boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's warm smile had become the gravitational center of San Remigio. Isabel, now a young lady of 13, whose talent for music promised a brilliant future, and Dolores, a 10-year-old girl with inexhaustible energy and a gift for winning everyone's affection, adored their little brother with a devotion that moved. Esperanza, what are you thinking about? Sebastian's voice interrupted her reflections. Her husband approached along the path that led to the fields, his figure still imposing, but now more relaxed, as if the weight he had carried for so long had finally been deposited in the right place. About time, replied Esperanza with a smile. About how it transforms everything, people, places, memories. Sebastian sat beside her on the stone bench, placing an arm around her shoulders, while Miguel, recognizing his father, extended his chubby little hands toward him. For the better, I hope, he said, taking the child in his arms. For the more true, she corrected gently. And it was true. Time had not erased Sebastian's pain for the loss of Margarita, nor Esperanza's insecurities about her place in the world. What it had done was integrate these experiences into a wider, richer tapestry, where joy and pain, loss and finding were interwoven like threads in a complex but beautiful quilt. Margarita's letters discovered in the chest that day, that now seemed so distant, had been delivered to the girls at specific moments, just as she had planned. Isabel had received hers at her first piano recital, after years without playing the day she turned 12. Dolores would have hers next month when she celebrated her first communion. Each letter, each small gift left by a mother who could not see her daughters grow up, was a bridge between the past and the present, a way to keep alive not the pain of loss, but the celebration of what had been and continued to be through them. Matias Villanueva told me that the regent is coming to dinner tonight, commented Sebastian while Miguel played with the buttons of his shirt. It seems that Doña Mercedes has finally accepted his invitation. Esperanza nodded, thinking about how much things had changed in that aspect as well. Doña Mercedes Vargas, widowed for a year after the sudden death of Regent Joaquin Morales, had gradually modified her attitude toward her. They were not friends, probably never would be, but a mutual respect had arisen based on the recognition of their respective strengths. She has changed since Don Joaquin's death, observed Esperanza. She seems more human. Pain has that capacity, responded Sebastian with the wisdom of one who has walked that path. It strips us, leaves us without the masks we use to protect ourselves. A gentle breeze stirred the jacaranda flowers, making violet petals rain over them like a silent blessing. Miguel tried to catch one in his small hand, laughing when the petal slipped between his fingers. I was thinking about my quilt, said Esperanza after a moment of contemplation, about how the stories of the women of my family now intertwine with those of yours, about how Miguel and the next baby. She placed a hand on her womb, where a new, Life was beginning to form. We'll continue weaving this pattern that precedes us and will survive us. Sebastian covered her hand with his, a familiar and deeply intimate caress. Do you know what Isabel told me yesterday? He asked with a smile that illuminated his eyes. That she wants to be a teacher like you were for her. That she wants to teach music to the children of the town so that no one grows up without knowing beauty. Esperanza felt her eyes filling with tears. They were not tears of sadness or even of joy, but of a more complex, more mature emotion, the certainty that the seeds planted with effort and love were giving fruits that none of them had anticipated. And Dolores wants to be a baker, she added with a soft laugh. She says that when she marries and has to leave San Remigio, she will open her own bakery where she will bake bread in the shape of a jacaranda. The image was so typical of Dolores, with her overflowing imagination and her capacity to find joy in the simplest details, that both laughed in unison. Miguel, infected by his parents' laughter, emitted a gurgle of happiness that seemed to rise toward the sky like a prayer of gratitude. We should return, Sebastian finally said, standing up with Miguel still in his arms. The girls will be wondering where we are, and Doña Carmen will insist that you personally supervise the dinner for that woman, as she still calls Doña Mercedes. Esperanza got up, smoothing her dress with one hand, while picking up the sewing basket she had brought, with her with the other. The quilt now spread over the bed she shared with Sebastian had been complemented with new embroidery that told the story of her life in San Remigio, blooming jacarandas, the profile of the hacienda, the silhouettes of Isabel and Dolores Miguel's little hand. It was a textile diary that, like Margarita's letters, would someday serve for future generations to know their roots. As they walked back to the house, Esperanza thought about the long road that had led her to this moment. From the small bakery in her hometown to becoming the lady of San Remigio. From resigned solitude to this mature and complex love she shared with Sebastian. From orphanhood to this family she had built with pieces of previous lives and new dreams. The jacarandas, silent witnesses to her story, accompanied them on their way, their flowers creating a violet canopy that filtered the sunlight in patterns impossible to replicate. Like life itself, thought Esperanza, impossible to predict, but beautiful in its imperfection. That night after dinner with Doña Mercedes turned out surprisingly pleasant after the girls retired to sleep, after kissing their little brother and the belly that hid their future brother or sister, after Sebastian and she shared the events of the day in the intimacy of their room. Esperanza approached the window to contemplate once more the jacarandas under the moonlight. "Thank you," she whispered, without knowing exactly to whom she directed this gratitude. To her mother, perhaps, for teaching her not to retreat in the face of adversity. To Margarita for planting not only trees, but also seeds of love that continued to bloom. To Matias Villanueva for building a bridge between her previous life and the current one, or perhaps simply to fate, to that mysterious force that had led her to Santa Clara del Llano when everything seemed lost. Sebastian approached from behind, surrounding her with his arms in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Do you know what Esperanza means in the language of flowers?" he asked, resting his chin on her shoulder. "No," she responded, curious about this poetic facet that sometimes emerged in her husband, a memory of the sensitivity that Margarita had loved in him. "Rebirth," said Sebastian gently, turning her to look into her eyes. "The capacity to bloom again after the harshest winter." And as they merged in an embrace under the silver light that filtered through the window, Esperanza thought that there could be no more adequate name for the life they had built together in San Remigio, a rebirth, a continuous flowering, a love that, like the jacarandas, found a way to bloom again and again, conquering with its obstinate beauty even the most improbable terrains.